So, hi everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Chris Sperling. I am the Historic Preservation Planner for Calvert County, Maryland. And this is a relatively new position for me. I've been here just over a year, a little under a year and a half. And prior to this, I was the senior archaeologist for the Fairfax County Park Authority. And it was then that I really started my relationship with the Oyster Lifelong Learning Institute. And then they reached out to me to see if I'd be willing to do a class again. And I had to think about that for a while because my job has really changed. But after thinking about it, I said, sure, I enjoyed doing it because I thought it'd also be an opportunity to kind of show, to get away from just purely archaeology and kind of discuss kind of the broader realm of things that are done for historic preservation planning and historic preservation just more broadly. So with that, I have a presentation, and I thought that the best way of showing what the life of a historic preservationist and what the life of a preservation planner entails. And so hopefully you'll enjoy this. And I'm probably going to be coming in fairly short. So we can do a question and answer at the end if you have anything. I would happily entertain those. So hopefully I can get this to work. Okay, now with any luck, you're watching the screen, and you can see a beautiful image of that's the Drum Point Lighthouse. It's one of our historic districts here in Calvert. So, if anybody had seen me before with any of the presentations I've done before for Oyster, you'd know that they all really focused in on archaeology. And this is one of the last projects I worked on before I left Fairfax. If you saw any of the previous ones, you saw this field work. And I always loved, doing presentations on the field work that we were doing. I really enjoyed, sharing it. Archaeology is, I worked in the field of archaeology since I was 19, so it's coming up on 30 years now. And I always really identify myself as an archaeologist, and specifically as a field archaeologist. However, a little under a year and a half ago, I saw an advertisement for the Calvert County Department of Planning and Zoning. I knew the woman who was in this position before, and so I talked with her and decided if I would apply, and I did apply and was made an offer, and then I really had some decisions to make because while this was a great opportunity, it was also not a position, an archaeologist position. And it would entail basically no longer being a field archaeologist. And so that was something I had to grapple with. If anybody's not familiar, and it's understandable why you would not be familiar, this is where Calvert County is located. So we have the silhouette or the outline of the state of Maryland, and there in red, you can see Calvert County. My predecessor used to refer to it as the wet sock because that's what it looked like to her. A couple of the reasons that you may have never heard of Calvert County, if you haven't, is that geographically, it is the second smallest jurisdiction in the state of Maryland. The only jurisdiction that is geographically smaller is Baltimore City. When it comes to demographics, Calvert County is the least populous jurisdiction in the state of Maryland. So it's a small place where everybody really gets to know everybody else. You can see the flag, Calvert County flag behind you. And if you were wondering what the symbol was or what the leaf was, Calvert County until the year 2000, Calvert County's primary cash crop was tobacco. It was one of Maryland's 3 largest tobacco producing counties, generations of tobacco producers here. Then in 2000, the state of Maryland had a tobacco buyout, and almost all of the farmers took the buyout and no longer grow tobacco. So as far as Calvert County agriculturally, and we are a rural community, the main agricultural pursuits nowadays tend to be either market crops or things like meat production. We also have aquaculture, and we have a lot of watermen. Of course, Chesapeake is known for its crabs and its oysters, and Calvert County has been focused on that for hundreds of years. The one oral history interview I remember watching a while back, a woman says, on one side of my class ring was the tobacco leaf, on the other side of my class ring was a blue crab, and pretty much that sums up Calvert. And so that pretty much sums up Calvert. As far as employment here, we one of our main employers is the power plant, Calvert Cliffs Nuclear. And then, of course, like I said, we do a lot of agriculture, some tourism. Those are the primary pursuits that happen here. As far as history goes, Calvert County was established in the 1650s. And of course, people were occupying it prior to that. So it's a very old and historic county, not to mention, of course, the 13,000 years of Native American habitation prior to the arrival of English settlers. It should also be of note that this is a picture of the Sperling residence, and you can see in Calvert County. So I had to really ask myself, right? I had been identifying as a archaeologist for most of my life, and to me, it really defined who I was. And darn it, Jim, I'm a field archaeologist, not a bureaucrat. You know, could I actually make this change? Could I even just, from the aspect of identity, change my identity from that of being a field archaeologist to a bureaucrat? That was a major consideration. So too was this. I won't lie. Commuting from Calvert County to Fairfax is a killer. So I had to decide, was I willing to give up this to what I thought in my mind would be assuming a position doing effectively this. By nature, I'm telling myself I'm not a bureaucrat, but alas, I did decide to accept the position. And I think in the beginning, I just kind of thought I'd resign myself to it, that this was going to be my life as just a kind of desk-bound former archaeologist, bureaucrat type, and doing all the things that bureaucrats do. So here, this is our database for permits and subdivisions. So as you can see, I process lots and lots and lots of permits, write lots of memos. The one you see on the right, the letter there, was a review where I got to review an archaeological report that I'd required. So kind of what you expect of the bureaucrat. Now I could go into an extended discussion about the permitting process in Calvert County, but we'll just leave it at no chickens on your property unless you have over 3 acres. We just require that. Oh, and let's not forget subdivisions and site plans. Got to do a lot of review of those too, right? So, but now that I'm thinking about it, one of the things that has to be permitted, one of the things that comes across my desk fairly regularly are demolitions. And demolitions are actually a place where I do get out of the office and I am doing field work, and I'm not just, an in the office bureaucrat. These are 2 that, that I got called out on because the owners wanted to demolish them. So I do get out, and this also gives me greater exposure to historic architecture. And that's something I'm learning a lot about. Also getting out gets you to interact with the citizenry. And I have to tell you that the Calvert County is such a close-knit community that it doesn't take long before you get a real sense for all the folks here. The one on the right, first off, the one on the left, if I recall correctly, when it was originally built, it was a Swedish immigrant who came to Calvert County in the late 1800s and built this house on Solomon's Island because he worked there as a commercial fisherman. The one on the right looks just like a glorified shed. But one of the things we found out about it as you went in is that this building hides its secrets. And we started to see, if you can see my pointer right there, windows that have been covered up. Well, why do you have windows on a shed? That doesn't make any sense. And then we noticed as we went inside that it was giving up little bits and clues about its former lives, one of which was as a dwelling. And when somebody was repurposing some of the barn wood, they went in and noticed, one, that the gaps in the walls had been insulated. Barns don't come insulated. Insulation is really saved for habitation. And they had insulated it with newspaper. And the newspaper happened to have a date on it. And the insulation, at least, was put in 1861. So we have what had been a pre-Civil War domestic shelter house, perhaps even slave quarters. And on seeing it, all you would really think is that it was just a dilapidated shed. It had gone from being converted from some kind of dwelling to a shed, and then to, you can see here, the big cutout is the, where it had been converted into use for a garage. So, another one of the bureaucratic functions that we have, or that I have here at Calvert County, is the role of being the staff for our local historic district commission. As you can see here, this is our chapter in the Calvert County Code of Ordinances. So we have it codified into our law that the county can establish historic districts. It comes with several benefits, including tax breaks. And I know everybody loves a good tax break. Because of this, and because of my role, there are a lot of additional bureaucratic things that I have to do, especially with tax breaks. Tax breaks are financial. Tax credits, I should say, are financial. And what our program does is, if a designated Calvert County Historic District is doing work that confirms, that improves a property, designated historic district property, that 25% of the cost of those improvements can then be applied to a property tax break, property tax credit, and that can be rolled over for up to 6 years or until it's exhausted. So I spend a lot of time then in front of the Board of County Commissioners. In fact, I spent almost all of yesterday at the Board of County Commissioners, primarily to give a presentation and then to read a memo. Now, if that's not bureaucracy at its best, what is? Of course, now that I'm thinking about this one too, because of this, we have to verify tax credits. We can't just give out tax credits assuming that somebody really did the work that they said they did. So what we have to do is go out and verify, and we take photographic evidence to include with the folder. So this also gets me out into the field, and because they're all county historic districts, really exposes me to some of the finest historic resources that we have in the county, ranging an incredible span of time. Here you have, this is the Archers Hayes Historic District. It's up in the northern part of the county. What you're seeing is not the whole district. This is just the corn crib. We visited this recently as the owners are looking at doing some fixes to it and some improvements to it. I like to highlight this one because as we were looking at it, one of the things that we discovered were these marks, and I'll circle them here for you. And these marks are the joiner's marks, where you can see this was hand joined Uh, um, and the carpenters, the joiners, whenever they put them together, most likely made the cuts, made the joints, and then they had to remember where to put everything. And think of this as your instructions, as your cheat sheet, where, sorry, where they've carved into the wood these numbers. I don't know why these are backwards, but they are. But you can see here, it's 7 to 7. Match the two, and there's your joint. Again, getting to learn more about architecture, and here I am out in the field again. And some of our other historic districts and ones that I've toured recently, we have the Wild Simmons House, late 19th century. The corn crib in the previous image, that was probably right at 1800, is architectural historians' estimate on that. Lyle Simmons was late 1800s, post-Civil War. Recently just had some work done fixing some of this wood siding. There's Preston on the Patuxent, one of our newest historic districts, 18th century, and possibly even going back to the 17th century in some of the portions of this structure. So yeah, I get to go out and really kind of expose myself to a much broader range of the resources than I would have in my previous existence, where I was really kind of a site-by-site person. And another example, here's the Lower Oyster House historic picture on the right. And Lower was having some utility work done. Lower Oyster House was a big employer, especially for African-American women, right around the turn of the century, 1900 up until the 1960s, I believe. And the boats would come in, and the watermen would come in and deposit, all of their oysters, and the women in there would then clean, shuck, and can. Oystering having been historically another one of our important industries, and one that remains important today. Go figure. Picture on the left, when you dig excavations around an old oyster house, you find a lot of oyster shell. And in fact, one of the problems that we have with this is that the tide goes through this building twice a day. And when it's one of our king tides or one of our blowout tides, that water can actually be shin deep or better, rolling right through this. Here we're dealing with the effects of climate change, sea level rise. So now, now I'm going from being this desk bureaucrat to being out in the field and watching it and having to deal with broader issues. How do you mitigate the impacts of daily tides to a historic structure, and what are the appropriate approaches? Oh, there's a picture. I just really like that picture. That's a picture of the inside of the Lower Oyster House, one of the old packing rooms. So that doesn't list all of my bureaucratic functions. So bureaucracy. Before I led a field and lab, a full archaeological team, and now I don't have that anymore. One of the things I really do miss is working directly with a staff, and not to mention just having the resources, having a staff of people who are there and can react when it's necessary. But here in Calvert, I don't have an archaeological team. And one of the ways that we still make sure that we can do archaeological and other types of historic preservation is through the application of grants, mostly from the Maryland Historical Trust. And you can see they have a variety of programs, heritage areas, certified local government, and the African American heritage. So a lot of funding opportunities that are made available. Mostly these are federal monies that are then allocated to the states for distribution. And so it's the state that actually administers these grants. So lots of grant writing and managing grants. Back to the bureaucracy, right? So I'd previously talked about the historic districts, Calvert County historic districts. And one of the things Calvert County historic districts have to agree to for the designation and the potential tax credit is they have to agree to follow what we refer to as our design guidelines. And this gives guidance for things like materials, how to, and the appropriate way of matching fenestration, of siding, of new construction, a whole range of things that people may want to do with their historic properties. This guide then helps them do it in a way that can make sure that their property maintains its historic significance. As you can see here, our guidelines, that are currently in effect, were drafted in they were drafted in 2000, approved in 2001. That was a long time ago. That's coming up on 23 years ago. The original guidelines had been funded by certified local government grant, again, administered through the Maryland Historical Trust. But we also realized that they were getting to an age that they were just things that hadn't been considered. In particular, the effects of sea level rise, effects of climate change on historic properties and how to deal with that. And again, new materials. The former guidance had been only ever replace and repair in kind. Well, nowadays there are materials that are made that very, very, very closely approximate historic materials, but are much cheaper and or much more durable. So we needed to include places where those can be included, where it would be okay to use some of these new materials. So we sought another certified local government grant administered through the Maryland Historical Trust. And here we have our draft guidelines. You can see much updated and really a much improved product. We had this contracted out to a consulting firm, and these are currently making their way, going back to my bureaucratic functions, are currently making their way through the approval process, going through the various commissions that have to sign off, and eventually to be approved by our county commissioners. And then we'll have to actually draft a formal resolution, because we're dealing with government and with law and with, so one of the things that we actually need to do as a part of this is once the county commissioners approve, I'll draft a resolution that will negate the previous resolution and adopt these as the official guidelines for Calvert County historic districts. So again, grants, lots of bureaucracy, lots of paperwork, lots of desk time. Of course, now that you think about it, these grants have funded a lot of active field work. And as the manager and as the person who is the grantee, I have to be out there and I have to be checking on things, at least checking, if not assisting. Here you can see work that was also funded by it was a Heritage Areas grant. And when I arrived here at Calvert, this project had been wrapped up and I was just finishing the final kind of administrative work for it, and reviewing and doing coordination. So you can see here, we have the archaeologist into this large pit feature, maybe a cellar feature. The work that was funded was archaeology of what's known as the Calverton. And Calverton was Calvert County's original county seat, dating back to the late 17th century, the late 1600s, and then remained the county seat until, I believe, 1711. And then the county seat was moved to the more central location of Prince Frederick, where we still remain today. So that was funded by a grant. Oh, here you can see, this is an old map, a little bit grainy because I'm zoomed in really far. And here you can see Calverton circled, and that little symbol meaning that it was our courthouse. So, and this picture, that's Dr. Matt McKnight from the Maryland Historical Trust. He's the chief archaeologist for the state. And he came out and even helped do some remote sensing on the site so that the archaeologists could better target the features, target their excavations. And what that ends up doing is because grants are relatively small and you're not really going to get much of a second chance, more than likely, this allows you to apply those grant dollars as most efficiently. And then, of course, there's also a public component. So over here, we have members of the Archaeological Society of Maryland who assisted professional contractual archaeologists with this examination. One thing I'd like to draw your attention to, not inside and not at a desk. In the future, one of the grants I have out right now is to do archaeology on an archaeological site that that is eroding out of the banks, the bluff of the bays, formation that we refer to as Calvert Cliffs. As you can tell by the picture on the left, coastal erosion is a major problem here. And you can see along the cliffs houses that had been 100, 200 feet set back from the bluff line when they were constructed 30 years ago. And now we have ones that have lost porches and ones that have completely tumbled into the Chesapeake Bay. When I first started this position, I was approached by a local artifact collector, beachcomber. The formation of Calvert Cliffs, one of the things it's really famous for globally, is it's one of the best assemblages of fossils, ancient fossils, dinosaur fossils. We regularly are having fossils that are eroding out, skulls of millions and millions of year-old animals that then either the Smithsonian or the Calvert Marine Museum, another one of our gems, by the way, plug for Marine Museum, sends their scientists to go and remove, usually for eventual museum display at the Marine Museum. Well, when this collector was combing the beach, she happened to come across these items over on the right. And you can see what these are white clay tobacco pipes. And we can know archaeologically, tobacco pipes can tell you a fair amount if you have the right pieces. And we do, because you can see that some of these are made of a more reddish clay. And that reddish clay, we refer to this as Chesapeake pipes. They were locally made, sometimes by early settlers, sometimes by Native Americans. And we know that those almost always date to before 1700. And then you can see that the tobacco pipe, one of the tobacco pipes that's white, has this mark with the L and the E. And as archaeologists, we know that from previous research that the LE maker's mark refers to an individual by the name of Llewellyn Evans, who was a tobacco pipe maker in the town of Bristol, England. And the collector found these on the beach. The tobacco pipes. These tobacco pipes date to 3rd to 4th quarter 17th century. So 1670 to about 1680, 90 is a general time frame for these. So with that information, what we assume is that we have a 17th century archaeological site eroding off of the cliffs. And 17th century sites are very, very rare. Even in our area that has them, they're extraordinary. I never worked on one in Fairfax. And so I have a grant in now, hopefully to do some archaeology on the bluff. And with any luck, if there's any part of the site left, we can salvage it rather than just only allow it to erode out. Because once it erodes into the beach, we lose our ability to really learn a lot about the site. So it appears that I'm back into archaeology because I had to go and scout the site out, which, darn is all of 5 minutes from my house, and then requires that I go for long strolls with views like this. There again is Matt McKnight. Matt McKnight does a lot of work. He does a lot of this remote sensing to help kind of see, for lack of a better term, what's underneath the surface. And he came out and helped look for any anomalies or disturbances that he could detect with his machine at the site to help me inform my grant writing process. But again, it's Not as bureaucratic as I thought, right? Ah, now we get to a big part of my job. So, citizen calls and messages. The thing about working and living in a very small community in a very small jurisdiction is people don't send anonymous emails and expect to wait a week for them. They pick up the phone, call you, and you're expected to answer. So I respond a lot to citizen inquiries. The picture on the left, you can see the tobacco barn. Ever since the buyout, it's been really difficult with us for tobacco barns in particular, because tobacco barns, if anybody's familiar with them, they have to have shutters or louvers because air has to flow through them. The tobacco barn is where the tobacco would be hung and would cure from when it was harvested until enough time had passed, usually in fall, I guess early fall, would be when the leaves had cured enough, and then they would be packaged, tied into these things called hands. And you'll see one of those, or you saw one of those when you saw the picture of my desk. That's a hand of tobacco that I have hanging up on the wall. And then those hands were then packed into hogsheads, large casks, usually ranging between 500 pounds to 1,000 pounds when they were filled. And what you can see on the picture on the left, that big thing that the gentleman is holding on to, that's what we call usually a tobacco prize. Some people call it a tobacco press. And this was a fancy one. This is a two-shooter. You can do two hogsheads at once, where you use this to pack the tobacco tightly in, and then you slip the cover in between the two, and then pack the second hogshead. A lot of these we don't find a lot of these anymore. And so it was interesting. It was fun. It was neat. There was still one of them that was, I believe, functional in this barn that we came in on. The problem with the structure that is open to the elements, open to the at least to the air movement, is that accelerates decay. Now, we have lots of barns in this county that are 200, 250 plus years old. We have a couple that are over 300 years old. And, but they're only salvaged because they're only saved because people want to save them. Since the tobacco buyout, there's been an excess of tobacco barns. And by and large, there's no use for them. They'd be expensive to convert. They're completely uninsulated, and being able even to convert one, but still maintain its historic look from the outside while still being functional for anything on the inside is very difficult. That said, I put a call out and to see if people would be willing to put their tobacco barns into preservation. And what I discovered was something really worked to my detriment, which was that most barns, go figure, are on farms. And these farms tend to put their property in agricultural preservation, where they've gotten their properties and they've sold the development rights or transferred the development rights so that this property will supposedly in perpetuity remain agricultural and undeveloped. And they get a really, really good deal for that. Pretty much, if they're willing to put their property into agricultural or rural preservation, they're not going to have to pay property taxes. Only problem with that from my perspective is that really makes my 25% tax credit pretty useless to somebody who's not paying property tax as it is. However, the flip side of that is it's still in preservation. And one of the things I'm learning here in this job is that agricultural preservation or rural preservation is still preservation, and it's still historic preservation, because anything that is there is not going to be developed, which means, especially for archaeology, that those sites will be there undisturbed. And Calvert County is a place that cherishes its history, cherishes its heritage. And if we were to ask a farmer if he were willing to put an area of his field because it was archaeologically sensitive into no-till or low-till agriculture, more than likely they would agree to it because so long as it's still productive land. Case on the right is also very interesting. I won't say much about that just because it's active and it's something that I've been spending almost all my days on. again, not so bureaucratic. Uh, Going along with the citizen inquiries, I received a call from a family, and they wanted me to come and check out their property. And when I looked at the map, I was like, I want to check out your property because all of these map key things are cultural resources. There are at least two barns, and then there are a lot of resources. If you see this linear one, that was a railroad, and more specifically, that was the Chesapeake Beach Railroad. It connected Washington, D.C. with Chesapeake Beach. Chesapeake Beach was developed in the late 19th century to be that getaway for Washington's elite. And to get there, they would take a train. And the train, the old railway, actually preceded it. The whole concept was created by a railroad guy from out in Colorado. And his notion was, if you build the railroad and give them a place to go, they're going to go. And so the railroad stayed in operation until the 1950s. It's also significant because, first off, that was a place for the wealthy Washingtonians to go for their recreation. But one of the reasons that they would come is because Chesapeake Beach was what was referred to as a sunset town. And for anybody who's not familiar with that terminology, sunset towns, African Americans could work in the towns, but they were not allowed to be on the street after sunset. And one of the things that we see increasingly as our motive is to get the stories of all of our residents. Calvert County historically was a majority African American county, and it stayed that way until the 20th century. And the African American community that's here has remained here. It's by and large multi-generational. And when I say multi-generational, I mean we have African American families who can trace their lineage back to the 17th century. The main demographic shift wasn't that African Americans left the county. It was that when the Calvert Cliffs nuclear plant was built, it resulted in a large infusion of primarily white people moving to Calvert. So one of the goals, like I said, is that we tell kind of all parts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. When the family asked if I would go and take a look at their property, I looked at what's called LiDAR imagery. And for anybody who's not familiar, LiDAR imagery, you can think of it like sonar or like radar, where a wave is sent out and then it bounces and then comes back and is interpreted. But instead of being either sound or radio waves, it's light. And so these light waves are bounced back up against the earth. They have to do a flyover. And the benefit of this is that they are highly accurate. Usually anomalies on the surface will be visible, anomalies up to about 6 inches in elevation. In other words, if you have a 6-inch mound, it'll show up on LiDAR imagery. It might show up as clutter, and you can see even here in this imagery, well, to go back to that just really quickly, one of the main reasons we love it is because of that high definition, but secondly, because it has the ability to see through trees. And aerial photography, even if it's done in winter, usually has a lot of visual obstructions. And so LiDAR affords us a way of looking at the ground from the desktop, but being able to see through the canopy. And to give you an idea, just how accurate, up here in the upper right-hand corner, you can see those are probably tire ruts. But of course, the thing that really popped out at me was this big rectangle. Nature doesn't make its own rectangles. And everything I looked through, going back from aerial imagery back to the 50s, showed nothing on this, just showed a wooded lot. And then the 1930 aerial showed a building of some sort. I don't know what kind. So I was very excited to go see the property. And sure enough, we went to where that anomaly was. And you can see we have these kind of brick walls, foundation. So we have this big foundation, big cellar feature. and I don't know anything about it yet. The amazing thing to me was that the family who's owned this property for 3 generations had also never knew about its existence. So it's a big property. It's not like, they had a half acre and didn't notice a gaping hole in it. I believe this property is about 350 acres, and this is really kind of tucked away in one of the corners of it. So, so I got to find something that the owners didn't even know was there. I was pretty proud of myself. And we'll be looking at doing some work in the future. That might be either a future grant project or something. It's not only citizens that just get up and call me. I also get them from the state. And the state called me and asked if I'd like to come out with the state underwater archaeologist and take a look at something. And when we arrived, this is what it was. And then on the right, you can kind of see it a little bit better. We've kind of cleaned it off. You can see the shape to a certain degree. It's a remnant of a boat, right? Here in Calvert, we have the bay on one side and the Patuxent River on the other side. All of our tributaries, we have all of our tributaries empty into one of those two bodies, and there is water practically everywhere. Water has just been a way of life in Calvert County since its earliest days. And we had hundreds, if not thousands of years of Native American boat construction, but because so many people would just have boats to accomplish their daily lives, to go to market, to visit family, to utilize our waterways as a transportation network. Lots of people had their own boats, and lots of people made their own vernacular boats. So here in Calvert, we have this tradition of vernacular boat making or shipbuilding, and evidence of it pops up every now and again. So I got to put on my muck boots and go out with the state archaeologist, state underwater archaeologist, and take a look at this boat. I thought that was pretty exciting. And then lo and behold, oh, yes, and then we mapped it. Of course, map it and record it for the record. And then we actually leave it in place. The conservation on this, the problem is once you remove it, you initiate a series of events that, especially for saturated wood, really lead to fast decay. And so we've actually found professionally that it's better to leave it in its environment. The occasional exposure, being out of the water, probably not doing much damage to it because the wood itself is so waterlogged that it remains wet until the tide comes back in. So that was interesting, working with the state underwater archaeologist, and it was an event so nice I did it twice. Got a call shortly, a few weeks after that, about another boat. And this one also along the Patuxent River in one of the tidal tributaries. And again, we went out and we did an underwater mapping, kayak mapping, where we measured the length of a fairly large boat for vernacular. And you can see here, it's, these might be remnants of, they look a little small to be remnants of a mast, but they might be part of the superstructure. So it doesn't come across as overly officey. Other people who give me a call. This is Detective Ted. I've become fast friends with Detective Ted. Because of a utility project that was occurring. The utility project came close to a former church property, and as a result, there was an unmarked grave that they unintentionally clipped a portion of. So the construction company, following their procedure and what is law here in Maryland, contacts our sheriff's office. The sheriff's office will arrive and will call in the medical examiner. Medical examiner will look at something, and then them with the sheriff's office will make a determination if there was any chance that it was foul play. And if it wasn't foul play and the remains appear to be old, then they contact the historic preservation planner. And I believe, actually, let's see here. And then the historic preservation planner. I wonder if I have slides out of order. Let me just check something quickly. No, okay. So here you can see the detective responded. the utility work. Then we have a process that this goes through. First, I have to call the state's attorney. His picture here is on the left. And it's kind of funny what happens, because the state attorney's role is to make sure that all processes were correctly followed and were adhered to according to Maryland law. And so according to Maryland law, I am required, the sheriff's required to go out and then notify me if it's archaeological or a historic resource. I then call the state's attorney's office, they check out the process, and then they get back to me. So I found it really interesting this first time that it happened, because I called the state's attorney's office, and then they call back an hour later and say, the state's attorney followed up on this. The responding detective informed me that he had contacted the appropriate person, so that you're aware. Just wanted you to make sure that as far as the state's attorney's office is concerned, everything was done in an appropriate method. So you can see this becomes really, really circular. The process is the detective, the medical examiner, me, the state's attorney, and then the state's attorney informs me that I was informed. But the law is the law, so you do what you got to do. For this instance, the second institution that I communicated with was the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory at Jefferson Patterson Park. As luck would have it, this is also in Calvert County, not terribly far from where I am right now. And as luck would have it, I used to work there. I met my wife when I worked there, and it is the official state archaeological repository. And we can make arrangements so that they can temporarily house things for us. So when these remains were unearthed, I contacted them so that there would be a safe, climate-controlled, and honestly respectful location for these remains to be housed, pending. And then I have to really start calling around. The church is no longer a church. It was used as a mission, but they did have a caretaker, and the caretaker made all these arrangements where a minister from one of the other local churches came and did a service, and they found a place within their cemetery to be reinterred. So what we ended up doing was, even though it was unfortunate that the grave was impacted by construction, we were very, very quickly able to not only get them back into the ground, but get them back into the ground at the location where the person had originally wanted. Whenever they died, whomever they were, we have no clue because it was unmarked. For whatever reason, they made a conscious choice that they wanted this church to be their final resting place. And we were able, working with the church and working with the various entities, we're able to secure a place within the chosen cemetery where this individual could be reburied. Then we got to President's Day. And just like I'm sure lots of other folks, I was, looking forward to sleeping in and, doing some stuff with the son and whatnot, having a little extra day to prepare for my Monday class. And then I got a call, and you'll never guess who was on the phone. It was Detective Ted again. Yay. And sure enough, it happened again. This is just a picture of the Patuxent River in its tidal location. The setting where the second set was identified was not unlike this. But it also goes to show that one of the things that we're dealing with again is coastal erosion and sea level rise. Because what we experienced here was what had probably been a burial. I can't really give a good date. If I had to give a date, I'd probably say around the 1800s. But what had been land eroded out, and these burials now appeared on the beach. This one only appears at what we refer to here as a blowout tide, which is a combination of events. It usually happens during the normal low tide, and when the high tide, when the tide cycles are intensified because of the moon cycles. And that's combined with a heavy wind from the northwest, north by northwest. it has to be a very strong breeze. And what that ends up doing is blowing the river out even further, oftentimes 3, perhaps 4 or 5 feet below its normal low tide mark. And that's the only time when it is visible. And so I was not able to make it there on time because the tide was already starting to come back in. But the citizen whose property it's adjacent has told me that he will give me a call the next time there is a blowout and that they are visible. So that'll be interesting. And that'll be another, muck boots along the Patuxent River, and then trying to figure out what is an appropriate, dignified strategy for maintenance of the remains that are there. So I've tried to spend the past almost hour now kind of going through and giving an idea of what I do now and how I traded in my fun life as a active fun life as a field archaeologist, and have now resigned myself to this bureaucratic role where I deal with tax credits and memos and subdivisions and forms and whatever. But I completely missed a slide. Oh, my slides are out of order. Okay, so we'll just do this. What I hope to do and what I thought I'd be doing was kind of rolling through my bureaucratic lifestyle. But it turns out it's not, right? That in fact, the job that I have now, while the paperwork is a lot of it, the truth is I end up spending a lot of time in the field. And a lot of time in the field doing new things and learning new aspects of our cultural resource environment, and trying to solve some of our mysteries. And so, indeed, my desk job that was supposed to be a desk job really isn't. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay. And we do have one question in the Q&A. Kathy asks, we can see that your experience as an archaeologist has improved your performance in your bureaucratic job. Has your experience in bureaucracy improved your archaeological skills at all?
Yes. I can definitely say that it has. In my previous roles, although most of what I did was driven by some sort of government requirement, whether that was a federal requirement for archaeology or state or local, I never had to really think past it as far as the requirement was. I'm doing this work because of some mandate. But more than that, I really didn't have to concern myself with. Where now what I'm dealing with are really kind of from the base up. So both the on the ground aspects of it, but then also realizing that there's a very good chance that I have to report this out, that this is going to result in actions that I now have to take further than I would have in my previous roles. So it allows me to kind of start from a point where I know something else is going to come up, and the bureaucratic education that I've received has taught me that. The other part about my bureaucratic part of my life is that I have something I haven't had before, and that's I have an administrator. And for anybody who's ever had an administrator before, you'll know they make everything work. And the administrator that works with me is absolutely fantastic and has this long memory. She is actually one of those people that I mentioned that has that goes back in this county multiple generations. So the other part that really helps my bureaucratic side and my archaeology side is my administrator who can keep me straight.
Okay, what happens when people want to declare a historical site and it's not approved? Do you get much negative feedback like you would in a big city?
It doesn't really happen that often here. I don't know. I know of properties that have pulled their own applications, but I don't know of any properties where the designation was denied. Pretty much, if in my experience, if the resource is over 50 years or so, and it meets any of the other criteria, then yes, we'll accept it. You saw my house. My house was built in 1930. I have considered getting it put on to the onto the county registry. The one thing is and the one reason why we have it pulled is, in this jurisdiction, you have a lot of people who don't like being told what to do by the government, and so when they find out that because of the guidelines that they have to agree to adhere to, that places some restrictions on what they can do to the exterior appearance of the house, or of the resource, I should say, that then we get pushback about that. What we also get are people who forget that there are a number of things that you have to that require what we call historic area work permits if it's a county historic district. And so I'd say one of the hard parts there is a lot of the folks here, apart from not like being told what to do, they like to do what they're going to do. They like to plan it and then execute it. And what they don't like doing is waiting. And unfortunately, if you're going to, let's just say, for a tax credit, you need to apply for your tax credit and your historic area work permit, and then wait until the second Wednesday of each month when the Historic District Commission meets. And then they have to approve it. And those do often get rejected, but they usually get rejected because they haven't adhered to the guidelines. And then when they get sent back, then they will change their plans usually. And then, but so then that could be up to a month wait until you actually get that permit. And then you do your work, and then we need the proof of it. We need proof of payment. We need photographs of the work that was done. I often have to go out and verify. And then you have to wait to the next Historic District Commission meeting. And then because it does have a financial impact for the county, it has to be approved by the Board of County Commissioners. So the Historic District Commission recommends that a tax credit be granted. And then I present it in front of the county commissioners. That's one of the things I did yesterday. And then they vote on whether or not to issue the credit. So that could be another 1 to 2 months, because the county commissioners have really busy agendas, and getting on the agendas. Now we're really getting into the bureaucracy of what I do, is making sure I get on agendas. But yeah, and actually going back to the first question, that's the other thing that this helps with is the bureaucratic aspect. Helps you really kind of see time differently. Knowing that you have to be, if you want to do something, you have to afford 2 weeks for legal. You have to allow for the next meetings of this organization before it can go to the next one. So hopefully that kind of scratched on the answer to that question.
Okay, Nancy says that she has come across the name Jessup from Historic District, and she had relatives from the 1690s to around 1720s that farmed tobacco in Calvert County. Excellent.
I'd be interested to know. I'd be interested to know where the old family farm was.
Billy Block says, do most objects stay on site or go into a museum, most found objects?
With archaeology, and this is one of the things that you have to consider when you're doing archaeology, when you're planning it. So all of the objects, almost all of the objects, certain archaeologists may decide that there is limited value to collecting things like brick or oyster shell. Other archaeologists will say, no, they have to be collected because they have to be weighed. Personally, what I used to do with brick and shell and things that we generally consider to be not diagnostic, in other words, they don't really give a good indication of when they were made, and are pretty much similar, whether you're talking about 500 years ago or last week. For those, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll note, count, sometimes weigh, and discard in the field. Other folks collect 100%, even the non-diagnostic materials, and those are dealt with then at a later time. But in archaeology, the thing is that everything has to go back for analysis. The process is that it comes back from the field, it goes to the lab, it gets cleaned, it gets entered into a database, a very extensive database. And now with technology and with databases being what they are, we really integrated everything into that database. So you have physical location of where it was found. And that would usually be within a 1 meter by 1 meter square. And depending on how worthwhile it was to record the accuracy, we could have it down to within a centimeter of its location of recovery. And that's in 3 dimensions, right? So that's not only your XY axis, but that's also elevation, where at what height or depth inside your excavation was it found. All of that stuff got integrated into the database. Then it has to be curated for life. And this is why you really have to be careful when you're planning archaeology, because it's expensive and you're going to be taking up real estate. Almost every archaeological repository is at 100% capacity or greater. The Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab, I think, was running at about 125%, but they're expanding their holdings area. I worked there right when that building was built, and it was at 100% capacity. When it was built, it said this would be the state repository for the next 50 years. It was within about 10 years, it hit 100% capacity. So understanding that you are going to be creating, you have to understand that it's a responsibility, and that those materials are going to be there and be conserved for life. And for the most part, they're kept in repositories, not museums, because 99.999% of the things that we find are tiny pieces of brick or fish scales, or little pieces of nails. As I once said at a conference once, I said something to the effect of, in archaeology, we get 2 different types of artifacts. We get the unique and the ubiquitous. And while the unique are really, really cool to look at, the ubiquitous are the ones that generally give us a lot more information about what's happening. That said, there's always, not only is there always something that can be displayed, whether it's a traveling exhibit or a permanent exhibit somewhere, or as modern technology has showed us, and COVID has really exposed, is that museum needn't be brick and mortar, and an exhibit needn't be physical. And so now with digital photography, with 3D modeling, I work with a person where he's another archaeologist that works at Virginia Commonwealth University. Virginia Commonwealth. He does a lot of scanning and 3D modeling, where he gets materials and scans them and then makes little replicas, which are great because you can hand them out, you can give them to people and they can break them. I can give them to my 10-year-old and he can smash it. And it doesn't matter because it's a replica, but it still has the educational value of being an exact replica.
Okay. Wendy asks, is archaeology becoming more bureaucratic than field oriented?
I wouldn't say so. I would say I'm becoming more bureaucratic than field oriented, but a lot of that is because I was a field archaeologist for 30 years and it's really rough on the body. It's interesting because I think that there is an image, and in my classes, when I'm doing my introduction, I have a picture of Indiana Jones and I just say, this is me. It's one of the action shots, but it isn't. And there are lots of different types. I think that field archaeologists were always seen as, one, the kind of swashbucklers, right? I mean, they're always kind of out in the dirt and the grit, and they always thought that they were a little bit hotter than everybody else. Then you had, your field and you had your lab archaeologists, who really thought that field archaeologists were went a little too hard, loose and fast with the note taking. They're probably right. And what they realize is that there seems to be a prejudice in favor of the field, and the lab usually pays the price for it, because then money comes off of the greatest expense that you have in an archaeological project is the lab. By about, it constitutes usually about 60% of the budget when I was budgeting. And so when you realize that, and the lab knows, like, well, we do the largest chunk of the work, but the field gets all the glory. But then there are always the bureaucratic side, because probably about 90% of all archaeology that gets done in this country is done as a result of the federal National Historic Preservation Act, and then it's state and local offshoots. So there's always been, the bureaucratic element. I think we're slowly becoming better at working within a bureaucracy. Traditionally, we've been very bad advocates for ourselves, and our main goal was to not get noticed. One of the things about working here is that perhaps unlike other places, cultural resources, by fault of being in the planning and zoning department and part of the planning and zoning process, get a seat at the grown-up table.
Okay, Ann Wood says, "Hi, Chris. Great to see you.
Hey,
Can you
Ann,
talk about the ways you might be a conduit for volunteers who want to work in historic preservation and archaeology? And do you work with schools in Calvert County?"
So we're just beginning this. Ann was a great volunteer who worked with us back when I was at Fairfax, and so I can understand the root of her question. Yes, so the best way is to reach out to me. With COVID, that made certain things problematic. Now, hopefully, as hopefully we're turning a corner and it'll be less problematic. But for example, when it comes to grants, the grant that I wrote for the archaeology of the site that's eroding into the Chesapeake Bay, that one will be contracted. If we're awarded the grant, it'll be contracted to a professional firm. But part of that was there is an archaeological component, a public outreach component, where there would be minimal volunteer days, and I could envision having volunteers almost every day, especially if they came with with the background knowledge that they needed. So that's one avenue. Another avenue is I don't have a team anymore. So things like the Cranston property, originally I was going to go and do limited archaeology on the property, but the family was aware. I said, this is going to take years, because what I can only do is I can only promise myself, and I can probably give 1 day a week, maybe 2 days in the summer when I'm not teaching. And so that's a place where I will be needing volunteers, not even necessarily that property, but other properties. There are many things that come across my desk where I do not have a regulatory role, in as much as I am required to review it, but I can't say no. And when those things happen, then I can often reach out to the landowner and say, look, there's this potential here. I really want to check it out. And they always have the right to refuse, but I have one right now where I contacted them. It's going to be a long process, and it doesn't cost them any money. And it turns out they're modestly interested. So probably in the next couple of weeks, I'll be going to that property and seeing if a reported Native American shell midden remains, or if that's completely eroded. So these are all places where I can do a public program and work with volunteers. As far as the schools, I made my first contact with the gentleman at Huntingtown High, yes. And he has an archaeology club at the school. And so I hope to be working with them fairly soon. So the educational role will continue.
Okay. Anna Mulville asks, are women going into archaeology?
Yes. So when I started archaeology, most archaeologists looked like me. They're white and male, and honestly, usually much whiter. It was a male-dominated field. If you look at some of the early quotes about it, One of the more egregious was by a fairly famous archaeologist of his time, who in the 60s or 70s said that women should not be field archaeologists because their heels cause damage to the archaeological site. And I would say it was still very male centric when I started, but over the next years, and really within 10 years of me starting, I would say that the pendulum flipped, and nowadays I can only anecdotally say that it seems as though there are more female archaeologists, that female archaeologists actually outnumber male archaeologists. And in my household, the female archaeologists don't outnumber male archaeologists, but they certainly wield more power.
Okay, wait, we do have one more question. It's from Stephanie Trachtenberg. She says she met you 5 years ago at Fairfax County Retired Educators and convinced you to speak 3 times at Ollie. Thank you for returning for the 3rd time. If Ollie folks think you look familiar, it's because your photo was used for years as the inside cover of the Ollie catalog, minus the beard.
That's hysterical. You can see I'm going for a different look. That was really because of COVID. I used to get my hair cut every other week, and I used to get it cut really, really short. And then I couldn't get it cut at all when the pandemic began. And so I just kind of thought to myself, well, I can't get a haircut. I'm not going anywhere other than my couch and the home office. So why am I shaving? And that's when I stopped.
And the rest is in the chat, and they're lovely thank yous for your speech. I can read them to you if you want, or you can just take a quick look at them.
I'll just take a quick glance at them. Thank you.
So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, and maybe we'll see you again in the future.
I hope so. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.